When the subject of UFO encounters is brought up, the most asked question is, where's the trace evidence? The physical proof that such an event actually took place. Now, there have been a number of instances where residual confirmation has corroborated eyewitness testimony, and this was no more evident than in an encounter on a lonely highway in Minnesota late one summer night. Because the witness in this case was of the highest character, and his story remains to this very day extremely strange. It's 1:40 a.m. on August 27, 1979, and Marshall County Deputy Sheriff Val Johnson is on patrol in his squad car, a 1977 Ford LTD, on Marshall County Road 5, some 10 miles outside the town of Stephen, Minnesota. As he approaches the intersection of Minnesota State 220, pausing at the junction to check for oncoming traffic, he sees what he describes as a very brilliant white light about 3 miles away in the center of the roadway that to him appears motionless. But this isn't the headlight of an approaching vehicle. The light is some 4 feet off the road, perhaps 8 to 12 inches in diameter, with very defined edges. Wondering if this is perhaps a small private aircraft forced into an emergency landing, he observes it for a moment before driving down 220 with an abundance of caution for about 1.25 miles at a speed between 60 and 65 miles per hour. What occurs next will result in one of the most astounding and compelling cases in the annals of UFO history. The light he spotted that at one point appeared to be hovering, abruptly accelerated and in mere seconds was directly in front of his patrol car, seemingly engulfing it and blinding the officer. He claimed that as it approached it made no sound. Then the inevitable occurred as the object collided with his vehicle. Amid the sound of shattering glass and impacted metal, Deputy Johnson was rendered unconscious by the collision, his patrol car still in gear. When he regained his senses, he found himself and his vehicle more than 900 feet from the point of impact, spun sideways in the road, its front end in a ditch in the opposite lane. The car was not running, but the engine light was on. The time was now 2:19 a.m. Val Johnson had been unconscious for some 39 minutes. Behind the car were skid marks that measured 854 feet in length, no doubt made by his car, though Johnson was certain he had not touched the brakes before he passed out from the crash. The confused and disoriented patrolman reached for the radio on the dashboard and called in a 1088, signifying an officer requesting assistance. This is the actual call to the station by Val Johnson.
407, what is your condition?
I don't know. Someone just hit my car. I don't know how to explain it. Strange.
Are you, what's your condition? Are you okay?
Something attacked my car. I heard the glass breaking and the brakes locked up. I don't know what's going on.
10-4, I'll get a hold of 406 Stephen and send him on his way.
Marshall County Deputy Sheriff Everett Doolittle was first to arrive at the scene and assess the situation, with an ambulance already en route to their location. He found Johnson slumped against the steering wheel and appeared to be in a state of shock, claiming above all else that he was experiencing severe pain in both eyes. Johnson was then transported to nearby Warren Hospital, where he underwent a host of examinations, including a series of x-rays. It was determined that indeed his eyes had suffered similar damage as one might expect a welder would from exposure to intense light. It was further discovered that his inner eye also displayed injury akin to contact with an extremely bright light at a close distance. Yet despite the crash he had just been involved in, other than a small bump on his head, he suffered no serious head injury or signs of a concussion. Initial observations strangely revealed that both Johnson's wristwatch, as well as the clock in his car, were running exactly 14 minutes behind the actual time. What added more mystery to this observation was that it is a point of emphasis that before each shift, watches and clocks are synchronized to those in the police station. The resulting investigation took on a heightened sense of urgency as a fellow officer had been injured. In that time, some theories were put forth as to the origin of the blinding light, with the possible presence of ball lightning being one of them, and an explosion within the overhead power lines being another. Ball lightning was quickly dismissed as an option, as it would not cause a dent to appear in the vehicle's hood. But the most extraordinary evidence was the further damage to Johnson's vehicle. Beyond the hood being dented and perforated with an unusual charring mark at the bottom, a headlight and the red bubble light on the light bar were broken, and the windshield displayed significant damage with 3 distinct impact marks in a teardrop formation. In fact, Johnson's last conscious memory was the sound of breaking glass, and indeed the windshield had been cracked extensively, signaling a direct impact with something. The tops of the antennas on the rear roof of the car were bent backwards at 60 and 90-degree angles in complete line with each other, which further suggested they had been struck by a passing object at high velocity. It was at first surmised that the antennae were bent by the forcible braking of the vehicle, hitting the dome lights of the car, which resulted in them bending from the emitting heat. But tests conducted at Honeywell Labs would determine that the antennae were bent by force and not from the heat or the momentum generated by a violent stop. They were also spring-loaded at their bases, which further gave credence to whatever impacting the car traveling at a remarkable rate of speed so as not to even bend them at their base. It was becoming clearer that something had struck the patrol car while both were traveling in opposite directions, and that the left side of the vehicle took the brunt of the impact, with the damage limited to about 1 foot in width. An expert from the Ford Motor Company, Meriden French, was consulted, and his conclusion after several days of examination was that, quote, the crack patterns and apparent sequence of fractures seemed to be due to inward and outward forces acting almost simultaneously. French would go on to say that the cause of damage to the windshield was from mechanical forces of unknown origin, but deeper analysis likened the crack to a shock wave-induced breakage. Meanwhile, as for Val Johnson, he appeared to be healing well from his injuries, with the burning in his eyes subsiding only 6 to 8 hours after the incident, but he still had difficulty recalling anything that happened after his car had been struck. In short order, and lacking any rational explanation for what happened on that lonely stretch of road, Alan Hendry of the civilian UFO group QFOS, the Center for UFO Studies, was summoned by Sheriff Dennis Brecky to conduct his own inquiry, as it seemed not out of the realm of possibility that an airborne unknown object had struck the patrol car, leaving behind physical damage not often seen in these types of encounters of the second kind. Val Johnson's character and credibility were deemed to be beyond reproach, making it highly unlikely that there was any nefarious reason to concoct such a wild story. Some interesting details came to light as a result of those investigations. The first concerns dental work. Johnson had some performed prior to the morning of the accident, with a follow-up scheduled a few days afterwards. An oral X-ray had determined his front bridge work showed no abnormalities, but the follow-up days later showed it was no longer intact and broken at the gums, which clearly may have been the result of the impact he suffered from the accident. But oddly, there was no swelling or pain associated with this, as there well should have been. Even more curiously, Johnson had described the feeling that he was hit in the face with a 400-pound pillow in the immediate aftermath of the incident. It's unclear if that sensation in some way relates to the change in dental structure, but it's nonetheless a very pertinent observation. In terms of the cracked windshield, the point of impact was far too low to have been caused by Johnson's head striking it. A seemingly minor but unusual detail was that insects that had adhered to the antenna in the normal course of travel had not been wiped from the surface by the impact, further underscoring the rate of speed and the limited areas in which they were struck. Val Johnson's squad car now sits in the Marshall County Historical Society Museum, with the original damage to the vehicle preserved and untouched. When interviewed and asked what he believed happened, Val Johnson's response was that he thought he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see, and whatever had struck his vehicle was preventing him from doing so. A very devout man, he also wondered if perhaps this was merely an act of God at work. Perhaps not surprisingly, the National Enquirer had approached him and offered to pay to have him undergo regressive hypnosis in exchange for the exclusive rights to his story, but he refused their offer. Johnson has since retired from the force and moved to Wisconsin. He rarely gives interviews and speaks of the stress and unwanted attention the incident brought to his family, but he has said he hopes that continued government disclosure of UFOs will bring a new perspective to his story. It should be noted that other requests for regression hypnosis were offered to be performed in a more clinical setting, with a promise that the results would never be released to the public. But Johnson declined those as well, stating he had no desire to recall what had happened. But he has claimed one unusual residual effect from the incident was that from time to time he would randomly think of 3 words: "I am committed." And he said those words stuck in his head like a catchy commercial jingle might. So at the present time, it can only be said that something quite unusual happened on that stretch of road known as Minnesota State 220, and no truly adequate explanation exists as to what Val Johnson encountered in the early morning hours of August 27, 1979. And because of that, in the end, the incident will forever be listed in the annals of law enforcement and ufology as unexplained.